I stood there in the ornate family clubhouse, the smell of polished wood and expensive wine filling the air, watching my wife's mother, Eleanor Whitmore, as she sipped her fancy imported drink. She held the glass like it was a crown, her lips curling into a laugh that cut through me like a knife. She was laughing at me, at my membership application for the Whitmore Legacy Golf Club. "This club is for elite members only," she said, her voice dripping with that high and mighty tone she always used when she wanted to put me in my place. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, but I didn't let it show. Beside her, my wife, Olivia, didn't even try to hide her smirk. "Stick to public courses," she added, barely glancing my way, like I was some stranger who didn't belong in her perfect little world. Her words stung, sure, but I just smiled. A slow, quiet smile that hid everything they didn't know about me. They thought they had me figured out, thought I was just some nobody they could brush off. They had no idea what was coming. I turned and walked out of that stuffy clubhouse, my shoes clicking on the marble floor, leaving them to their arrogance. The heavy doors swung shut behind me, and the cool air outside hit my face like a wake-up call. I didn't say a word as I left, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I didn't need to. They could laugh all they wanted tonight, sip their wine, and pat themselves on the back for being so much better than me. But what they didn't realize, what they couldn't even dream of, was that I already owned their mortgage. Yeah, that big, fat $100 million debt they thought was safe in some bank's hands. It was mine now. I'd bought it, piece by piece, through moves they'd never see coming. And tomorrow morning, when the sun came up and they were still sleeping off their smug little party, their entire world would come crashing down. I could already picture it. Eleanor's face going pale, Olivia's smirk disappearing. They thought they were untouchable, but I was about to show them just how wrong they were. The drive home was quiet, just me and my thoughts. The city lights blurred past the car window, but I wasn't really seeing them. My mind was on what was ahead, on the moment they'd find out the truth. I wasn't some broke loser they could laugh at. I'd been working for months, maybe even years, to get to this point. Every time they'd looked down on me, every snide comment they'd made, it had just pushed me harder. I'd built something they couldn't even understand, a plan so tight, so perfect, they'd never see it until it was too late. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as I thought about that application they'd laughed at. It wasn't even about the club, not really. It was about them thinking they could keep me out, keep me small. Well, tomorrow, they'd see I wasn't small at all. I'd been playing a game they didn't even know existed, and I was about to win. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I just stood in the dark living room, looking out the window at the quiet street. Olivia wouldn't be home for hours. She'd stay at the clubhouse with her family, probably still giggling about how they'd put me in my place. That was fine. Let her enjoy it while it lasted. I walked over to my desk, pulled out the folder I'd been keeping locked away, and flipped it open. There it was, the paperwork, the proof, the mortgage documents, the bank transfers, all the little steps I'd taken to get here. I ran my fingers over the pages, feeling the weight of what they meant. This wasn't just about money. This was about power, about showing them they didn't own me. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., the foreclosure notice would hit, and they'd have no idea what to do. I closed the folder, leaned back in my chair, and let that smile come back. They'd laughed at me tonight, but I'd be the one laughing tomorrow. I was driving through Whitmore Estates that night, the fancy gated mansions looming up on both sides of the road, each one bigger and shinier than the last. The streetlights cast long shadows over the perfect lawns, and I couldn't help but think about how blind Olivia's family was to what was really going on. They thought they owned this place, every house, every blade of grass, every stuck-up neighbor who waved at them like they were royalty. And sure, on the outside, it looked like they had it all together. The Whitmore Legacy Golf Club, that big, fancy place her great-grandfather had built way back when, was their crown jewel. They acted like it was some unbreakable empire, a symbol of their power that would last forever. But I knew the truth. That club had been bleeding money for years, drowning in debt they couldn't pay off, no matter how much they pretended everything was fine. That $100 million mortgage they'd taken out to keep it going? It had gone into default months ago, and they didn't even know I was the one holding the reins now. I'd bought that debt 3 months back, and I'd done it so quietly they'd never suspect a thing. No big announcements, no flashy moves, just a bunch of shell companies I'd set up, moving money around like pieces on a chessboard. It wasn't easy, mind you. I'd spent nights hunched over my desk, figuring out how to make it work, calling in favors, and talking to bankers who didn't care who I was as long as the numbers added up. But I pulled it off. I owned their debt, their precious club, their whole damn world, and they were still strutting around like nothing could touch them. As I drove past the entrance to the golf club, its big iron gates gleaming under the lights, I couldn't help but smirk. They thought they were so smart, laughing at me in that clubhouse, telling me I didn't belong. Well, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and checked it while I waited at a stop sign. There was a message from my banker, short and to the point. Everything's set. Foreclosure notice goes out at 9 a.m. tomorrow. I read it twice, just to let it sink in. That was it. The final piece falling into place. Come morning, that notice would land right in their laps, and they'd have no idea what hit them. I could already imagine Eleanor's face, that smug look of hers turning to confusion, then panic. Olivia's dad, Charles, would probably yell at someone, thinking he could bully his way out of it like he always did. And Olivia? She'd probably just sit there, too proud to admit she'd been wrong about me. I put the phone back in my pocket and kept driving, the hum of the engine filling the quiet night. This wasn't the end, though. Oh no, this was just the start of what I had planned. The thing is, I hadn't done this just to get back at them. Though, I'll admit, that part felt pretty good. This was about more than revenge. It was about showing them that their fancy little world wasn't as solid as they thought. They'd built everything on quicksand, and I was the one who'd figured it out. All those years of them looking down on me, acting like I wasn't good enough for their daughter, their family, their club, it had lit a fire in me. I'd watched them waste money, throw parties, and keep out people who didn't fit their stupid rules, all while their empire was crumbling underneath. And me? I'd been smart. I'd worked hard, saved up, made the right moves. Now I had the power, and they didn't even know it yet. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., that foreclosure notice would rip the ground out from under them, and I'd be sitting back, watching it all unfold. The Whitmores thought they were untouchable, but I was about to prove they were nothing without me holding them up. It was 9 a.m. sharp, and I was sitting in my downtown office, a plain little room with a desk, a chair, and a window that looked out over the busy streets below. I wasn't at the Whitmore Legacy Golf Club, where Olivia's snobbish family was probably sipping their morning coffee and bragging about their perfect lives during their exclusive breakfast meeting. No, I didn't need to be there to know what was happening. Right at that moment, the foreclosure notice was being delivered to their boardroom, and I could picture it like I was standing in the room myself. The heavy oak doors would swing open, some nervous guy in a suit would walk in with the papers, and everything would stop. Eleanor would choke on her coffee, her fancy cup clattering against the table as she tried to figure out what was going on. Charles, Olivia's dad, would turn red in the face, his voice booming as he demanded answers. And Olivia? She'd probably just sit there, staring, too proud to show she was scared. I leaned back in my chair, a cup of cheap coffee in my hand, and waited for the updates I knew were coming. My phone buzzed on the desk, and I picked it up. It was my legal team, the guys I'd hired to make sure this all went down smooth. Notice delivered, the message said. Reaction was immediate. They're freaking out. I couldn't help but grin. Freaking out was exactly what I wanted. For years, they'd acted like they were above everyone else, like nothing could touch them. Now, here they were, scrambling like rats on a sinking ship. Another message came through a few minutes later. Eleanor's on the phone with their bank. They're not helping. Of course they weren't. I'd made sure of that. I'd spent weeks talking to the right people, pulling strings, making it so every door they tried to open would slam shut in their faces. The Whitmores thought money and connections could fix anything, but I'd cut them off at the knees. No bank was going to bail them out, not this time. The updates kept coming, one after another, like little fireworks going off in my head. Charles is calling around for emergency loans. All declined. Good. Let him sweat. He'd spent his whole life throwing his weight around, acting like the world owed him something just because his last name was Whitmore. Now he was finding out what it felt like to be powerless. Another buzz. They're reaching out to their rich friends. No one's biting. That one made me laugh out loud. Their high society buddies, the ones they bragged about at every party, were turning their backs now that the ship was going down. I could see it so clearly. Eleanor's voice getting sharper, Charles's temper flaring, the whole room turning into chaos. And me? I was miles away, sitting in my quiet office, watching their financial collapse unfold like a movie I'd written the script for. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the people rushing around below. Down there, no one cared about the Whitmores or their fancy club. Up here, though, I was holding their whole world in my hands, and it felt good. My phone buzzed again, and I glanced at it. They're arguing now. No plan. No way out. Perfect. That's what I'd wanted, to strip away all their options, to leave them with nothing but panic. The $100 million mortgage I'd bought wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a weapon, and I'd aimed it right at the heart of their empire. They'd laughed at me yesterday, told me I didn't belong, but now they were choking on their own arrogance. I didn't need to be in that boardroom to know I'd won this round. The cracks in their empire were showing, and there was nothing they could do to stop it from falling apart. Tomorrow, I'd take the next step, but for now, I just sat back down, sipped my coffee, and let them squirm. It was just past noon when the news hit, and I was still in my downtown office, flipping through some papers, when my phone lit up with alerts. Whitmore Legacy Golf Club faces foreclosure, the headline screamed. I leaned back in my chair, a little smile tugging at my lips as I scrolled through the articles. The reporters were all over it. Big, bold words about the fall of a family dynasty, questions about how it had happened so fast. I didn't need to read the details to know what was going on. I'd set this whole thing in motion, and now it was playing out exactly how I'd planned. By 3 p.m., my legal team texted me again. Emergency board meeting called. They're losing it. That was my cue. I grabbed my jacket, straightened my tie, and headed out the door. It was time to step into their world and show them who was really in charge. The drive to the Whitmore Legacy Golf Club didn't take long, but it felt like forever. My hands were steady on the wheel, but inside, my heart was pounding, not from nerves, but from excitement. I'd been waiting for this moment, dreaming about it ever since they'd laughed at me in that clubhouse. When I pulled up, the place looked the same as always, big, fancy, with its perfectly trimmed hedges and shiny gates. But I knew it was different now. I parked the car, stepped out, and walked toward the main building, my shoes crunching on the gravel path. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass and money, but it wasn't their money anymore. It was mine. I pushed through the heavy doors and made my way to the boardroom, where I could already hear raised voices echoing down the hall. They were scrambling, just like I'd hoped. When I walked into that lavish boardroom, it was like stepping into a storm. The long table was surrounded by Olivia, Eleanor, Charles, and a handful of other suits, people who'd spent their lives kissing up to the Whitmores. The walls were lined with old paintings of their ancestors, all those smug faces staring down like they still mattered. Eleanor was pacing, her heels clicking on the polished floor, while Charles barked into a phone. Olivia sat there, arms crossed, her face tight with anger. They all stopped when they saw me. Charles's eyes narrowed, and he slammed the phone down. "This is a private meeting," he snapped, his voice rough like he thought he could scare me off. I didn't flinch. Instead, I walked right up to the head of the table, the spot he usually sat in, and pulled out the chair. "Actually," I said, sitting down slow and easy, "as the holder of your mortgage, I have every right to be here." The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Eleanor's mouth opened, then closed, like a fish gasping for air. Charles's face turned a shade of purple I didn't know was possible, and Olivia just stared at me, her eyes wide for the first time in years. I leaned back in the chair, letting the weight of my words sink in. They hadn't seen this coming, not in a million years. All this time, they'd thought I was some nobody, some guy they could push around because I didn't come from their world. But I'd been working, planning, waiting for the day I could turn it all upside down. Now here I was, sitting at the head of their table, holding the keys to everything they'd built. "You?" Eleanor finally sputtered, her voice shaking. "You did this." I didn't answer right away. I just looked at her, then at Charles, then at Olivia, letting them feel the shift. The power wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine, and they were just starting to figure that out. I sat there at the head of the boardroom table, the silence still hanging heavy after I'd dropped the bomb about owning their mortgage. The Whitmores were staring at me like I'd grown a second head. Eleanor with her mouth tight, Charles breathing hard like he might explode, and Olivia just looking at me with those cold eyes of hers. I didn't rush. I let them stew in it for a moment, let them feel the ground slipping out from under them. Then I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table, and laid it out plain and simple. You've got two choices, I said, my voice steady. 1. You raise $100 million in the next 48 hours to pay off the debt. Or 2. You accept my restructuring plan and watch your family's power collapse. Pick one. It wasn't a question, it was a fact, and they knew it. Olivia was the first to snap. You can't do this, she hissed, leaning toward me like she could scare me into backing down. Her voice was sharp, the same tone she'd used 100 times to put me in my place. But this time, it didn't work. I just looked at her, calm as could be, and said, "Oh, but I already did." Then I reached into my jacket, pulled out a stack of legal documents, and dropped them on the table with a thud. The papers fanned out, proof of the mortgage, the default, my ownership. Everything was there in black and white, signed and sealed. Charles snatched them up, his hands shaking as he flipped through the pages, like he thought he'd find some loophole to save them. Eleanor just stood there, her face pale, clutching the back of a chair like she might fall over. They weren't used to losing, not like this. I could see the wheels turning in their heads, trying to figure out how to wiggle out of it. Raise $100 million in 2 days? They couldn't. I'd made sure of that. Cut off their banks, scared off their friends. They were stuck, and they knew it. The restructuring plan wasn't much better for them. It meant giving up control, letting me and my people take over, turning their precious club into something they wouldn't even recognize. I watched Charles's face twist as he read the terms, his jaw clenching tighter with every line. "This is blackmail," he growled, slamming the papers down. I shrugged. "Call it what you want," I said. "It's business. You should have paid attention to yours." That shut him up, at least for a second. He wasn't used to someone talking back, especially not me. Then the doors opened, and I heard the click of footsteps behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I'd planned this part too. 3 people walked in and stood at my side, and I could feel the air in the room shift again. "Meet your new investors," I said, keeping my eyes on the Whitmores. First was Isaac Palmer, a tall guy with a sharp suit and a sharper mind. He was the state's top attorney, the kind of guy who could win any case, but they denied him membership because he didn't come from old money. Next was Joseph Vega, a golf coach with rough hands and a quiet strength. He'd trained champions, but they'd turned him away because of where he grew up. Last was Dr. Caroline Lynn, a tiny woman with a big reputation as a world-class surgeon. She'd applied last year, and they'd quietly said no, thinking she didn't fit their image. Now they were all here, standing with me, ready to take what the Whitmores had kept for themselves. The look on Eleanor's face said it all. She knew these names, knew what they meant. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about tearing down their walls and letting in the people they'd shut out. The boardroom was still buzzing with tension after I introduced Isaac, Joseph, and Caroline as the new investors, but I didn't stick around to watch the Whitmores process it. I'd given them their 2 choices, raise the money or lose control, and now the clock was ticking. 48 hours wasn't much time, and I knew they'd fight like hell to save their kingdom. As I left the club and got back in my car, I could already imagine what was happening behind those fancy walls. Charles would be on the phone, yelling at every bank he knew, trying to pull strings like he always did. Eleanor would be calling up her high society friends, begging for help while trying to sound like it wasn't a big deal. And Olivia? She'd probably just sit there, saying nothing, too stubborn to admit they were in trouble. I turned the key in the ignition and drove off, the hum of the engine steadying my thoughts. Let them scramble. I had work to do. Over the next 2 days, I kept my ear to the ground. My legal team sent me updates every few hours, and it was almost funny how predictable the Whitmores were. Charles called every bank he'd ever done business with, big ones, small ones, even some shady offshore places. Every single one turned him down. I'd made sure of that weeks ago, talking to the right people, dropping hints about the Whitmores' bad finances. No one wanted to touch a sinking ship, and that's exactly what they were now. Eleanor wasn't doing much better. She worked her way through her list of rich buddies, the kind of people who showed up to her parties with fake smiles and expensive gifts. None of them would help. "Sorry, Eleanor, times are tight," they'd say, or "We can't get involved right now." I could picture her face getting tighter with every call, her voice sharper as she realized her precious connections were useless. It was satisfying, knowing their whole world was crumbling and they couldn't stop it. Olivia, though, she didn't do anything. My phone stayed quiet from her end. No calls, no texts, not even an angry message telling me I'd gone too far. That wasn't a surprise. She'd always been the type to freeze up when things got tough, hiding behind her pride like it was armor. I wondered what she was thinking, sitting there in that big house of hers, watching her family fall apart. Did she hate me yet? Did she regret laughing at me in the clubhouse? I didn't know, and honestly, I didn't care. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about the bigger picture, the one they'd never seen coming. While they were busy fighting to hold on to their old ways, I was already moving forward. I spent those 48 hours meeting with the younger members of the club, the ones who weren't so tied to the Whitmore name, the ones who'd been stuck in the shadows of all that legacy nonsense. I met them in a little coffee shop downtown, away from the club's stuffy air. There were about a dozen of them, guys and girls in their 20s and 30s, all decent golfers who'd never gotten a real shot because of the family's rules. You don't have to justify your family's legacy anymore, I told them, keeping it simple. You can be part of something better, something that's about skill, not who your parents are. They listened, nodding, asking questions. A few were hesitant, worried about what their fancy friends might think, but most of them were ready for a change. I could see it in their eyes. They were tired of the old guard, tired of being told they weren't good enough. By the time the deadline hit, I had them on my side, and the Whitmores? They'd failed. No $100 million, no miracle save. My phone buzzed with the final update. They're out of moves. It's yours. The power shift was official, and I was just getting started. The deadline passed, and just like that, the Whitmore Legacy Golf Club was mine. Or ours, really, since I'd brought Isaac, Joseph, and Caroline into the fold. I didn't waste any time. That same morning, I walked onto the property with my team, ready to start tearing down the old and building something new. The air felt different as I stepped onto the green. Less heavy, less stuck up. The club had always been this fancy, exclusive place where only the right people got in, but that was over now. We had control, and we were going to transform it into something greater, something that actually meant something. I stood there on the front lawn, looking out at the rolling fairways, and pictured what it could be. No more memberships based on who your daddy was, or how much money you had. From now on, it'd be about skill, real talent, not just a fancy last name. We got to work fast. First thing, we changed the rules. Membership wasn't about ancestry anymore. It was about how good you were on the course. If you could play, you were in. Didn't matter where you came from or what your bank account looked like. That alone sent shockwaves through the old members. I could hear them grumbling already, the ones who'd been born into this place, sipping their cocktails and whining about tradition. But I didn't care. Next, we started building a state-of-the-art golf academy for young talent, kids who'd never get a shot otherwise. Joseph took the lead on that, sketching out plans for training areas, simulators, even a little dorm for the ones who'd come from far away. He'd trained top athletes before, and now he'd get to do it here, on his terms. Then there was the mentorship program, Caroline's idea. She wanted athletes from all backgrounds to have someone to look up to, someone to guide them. We'd pair them with pros, people who knew the game inside and out. It was going to be big. At first, the old members fought back. I'd walk through the clubhouse and catch their whispers, guys in blazers muttering about how I'd ruined everything, how the club wasn't theirs anymore. A few even tried to start a petition to kick me out, like that would work. I let them complain. They could huff and puff all they wanted, but the numbers didn't lie. Within a month, top professionals started joining. Real golfers, not just rich hobbyists. Guys who'd won tournaments, who'd been on TV, who'd never bothered with Whitmore before because it was too stuck up. Now they saw what we were doing, and they liked it. When those names showed up on the roster, even the most stubborn old-timers started to quiet down. They couldn't argue with success. The club wasn't dying. It was growing, stronger than ever, and they couldn't stop it. And Olivia? She was around, but she didn't say much. I'd see her sometimes, walking through the clubhouse or standing on the terrace, watching the changes happen. Her face was blank, like she didn't know what to feel. She didn't yell at me, didn't beg me to stop, didn't even try to talk. She just watched, silent, like a ghost of the life she used to have. I wondered what was going through her head. Was she mad? Scared? Did she finally get that her family's way wasn't the only way? I didn't ask. She'd made her choice back when she laughed at me with her mom, and now she was living with the consequences. The club wasn't hers to control anymore. It was ours, mine, and the people who'd been shut out for too long. As I stood there, looking at the new signs going up and the kids showing up for tryouts, I felt something settle in me. This wasn't just about tearing the Whitmores down. It was about building something better from the ashes, and we were doing it. 6 months had flown by since we took over the Whitmore Legacy Golf Club, and now I was standing on the edge of the main green, watching the chaos of our first big tournament unfold. The place was alive. Crowds of people lined the fairways, cameras flashed, and the air buzzed with excitement. It wasn't like the quiet, stuffy events the Whitmores used to throw, where everyone wore the same blazer and clapped politely. This was loud, messy, real. Players from all over were out there swinging clubs, some big names, some new faces, all of them here because of what we'd built. The media couldn't get enough of it. Every article I'd seen that week praised the transformation, calling it a new era for Whitmore. They weren't wrong. The golf course that used to be a playground for the elite was now a battleground for true champions, and I couldn't stop the grin spreading across my face as I watched it all happen. The sun was high, beating down on the grass, and I could smell the mix of sunscreen and fresh turf in the air. I walked along the sidelines, nodding at the staff we'd hired. Good people, not the snobs the Whitmores used to keep around. Kids from the academy were out there too, wide-eyed and nervous, playing in their own division. Joseph was coaching a couple of them near the third hole, his voice calm but firm as he adjusted their swings. I caught his eye, and he gave me a quick nod, like he knew this was what we'd been working for. The crowd cheered as some pros sank a long putt, and I felt that rush again, the one that came from knowing we'd pulled this off. This wasn't just a tournament, it was proof. Proof that skill mattered more than status, that the club could be something bigger than the Whitmores ever dreamed. Then I saw him, Charles, Olivia's dad, standing up on the terrace, his hands shoved in his pockets. He wasn't part of the action, just watching from a distance, his face hard to read. I hadn't seen him around much since the takeover. He'd stopped showing up to complain after the first month, probably figuring it was a lost cause. But here he was now, looking down at the players, guys and girls from different backgrounds, all competing together on his old turf. I made my way up the steps, the noise of the crowd fading a little as I got closer. He didn't turn when I reached him, just kept staring out at the course. I stopped a few feet away, leaning against the railing, and let the silence sit for a minute. Then I said, "Still think I ruined the club?" My voice wasn't loud, wasn't mean, just curious, like I really wanted to know what he thought after all this time. He didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened, and I could see the lines on his face deepen, like he was wrestling with something. Down below, a young player, some kid from the academy, nailed a drive straight down the fairway, and the crowd roared. Charles's eyes flicked to the kid, then back to the horizon. He knew the truth, even if he wouldn't say it out loud. This place was thriving, better than it ever had under his family's watch. The old Whitmore way, with its locked gates and secret handshakes, was gone, and what we'd put in its place was drawing people in, not pushing them out. He shifted his weight, like he might walk away, but he didn't. Maybe he couldn't argue with what he was seeing. Maybe he didn't want to. Either way, I didn't need him to say anything. The tournament, the players, the cheers, they said it all for me. I turned and headed back down the steps, leaving him there to figure it out on his own. It was a year to the day since we'd taken over the Whitmore Legacy Golf Club, and I was standing in the clubhouse, watching a crew pull down the last of the old family plaques from the walls. The air smelled like dust and paint as they worked, the clatter of metal echoing through the big, open room. Those plaques had been up there forever, shiny brass things with the names of generations of Whitmores etched into them, each one a legacy member who'd never had to earn their spot. They'd been a symbol of everything this place used to be. Exclusive, stuck in the past, built for a few instead of the many. Now they were coming down, one by one, and I couldn't take my eyes off it. The workers stacked them in a pile, the names glinting in the light one last time before they'd be hauled away. Tonight, we were holding a ceremony to mark the end of that era, and I was ready to see it through. The room was already set up for the event. Long tables with white cloths, a podium at the front, chairs lined up for the crowd. We weren't just tearing things down, we were putting up something new. I walked over to the wall where the biggest plaque had been, the one for Olivia's great-grandfather, the guy who'd started it all. In its place was a new sign, simple and clean, with words I'd helped write. The Whitmore Golf Academy welcomes all who share the values of sportsmanship, mentorship, and community. Our traditions are honored by creating new ones. I ran my hand over it, feeling the smooth wood, and nodded to myself. This was what we'd been building toward, not just a golf club, but a place where people could come together, where talent mattered more than a last name. The Whitmore family's rule was over, and this was the final nail in that coffin. The ceremony started at dusk, with the sun dipping low and casting a warm glow through the big windows. People filed in, players, coaches, kids from the academy, even some of the old members who'd come around to the changes. Isaac, Joseph, and Caroline were there too, standing near the front, smiling like they knew we'd done something big. I took the podium, looking out at all those faces, and kept it short. "This isn't about erasing the past," I said, my voice carrying over the quiet crowd. "It's about making a future that works for everyone. The Whitmores built something here, but we've made it better." There was a murmur of agreement, a few claps, and then we unveiled the new sign. The room broke into applause, louder than I'd expected, and I stepped back, letting it sink in. This was real. The legacy they'd clung to so hard was gone, replaced by something stronger. Then I saw her, Olivia, standing at the back of the room, half hidden in the shadows. She wasn't clapping, wasn't smiling, just watching with those same cold eyes I'd seen 100 times. She'd shown up out of nowhere, dressed in a dark coat, her arms crossed like she didn't want to be there. I hadn't talked to her in months, not since the takeover really settled in. Part of me wondered why she'd come. Curiosity, maybe, or some last thread of attachment to this place. The ceremony wrapped up, people started mingling, and I kept an eye on her. She didn't move, didn't talk to anyone, just stood there until the crowd thinned out. Then she turned and walked out, her heels clicking on the floor, disappearing through the doors without a word. I didn't go after her. There was nothing left to say. Her family's time was done, and she knew it. I turned back to the new sign, the noise of the room fading around me, and felt the weight of it all lift. This was my win, our win, and she couldn't change that. The morning after the ceremony, I was back at the club, sitting in what used to be Charles's old office, now mine, going through a stack of scholarship applications for the academy. The sun was just coming up, spilling light across the desk, and the room was quiet except for the rustle of papers and the hum of the coffee maker in the corner. I liked these early hours, when it was just me and the work, figuring out which kids had the spark to make it big. We'd gotten dozens of forms, kids from all over, some with scribbled notes from parents, some with stats that made my eyebrows shoot up. This was the part one loved most, giving them a shot, the kind of shot I never had growing up, the kind the Whitmores would have laughed at. I was halfway through a form from a 13-year-old girl with a killer swing when I heard footsteps at the door. I looked up, and there she was, Eleanor Whitmore, standing in the doorway, looking uncomfortable as hell. She was dressed simpler than usual, no fancy jewelry, just a plain coat and a scarf, and her face was tight, like she'd rather be anywhere else. I leaned back in my chair, setting the papers down, and waited. She didn't come in right away, just stood there shifting her weight, her hands clasped in front of her. "Can I talk to you?" she finally said, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. I nodded, motioning to the chair across the desk. "Sure," I said, keeping it easy, though my mind was already racing. Eleanor didn't show up for no reason, not after everything. She sat down, slow and stiff, and stared at the desk for a second before looking up at me. "My granddaughter's 12, she started, her words careful. "She loves golf. Her coach says she's got real talent." I was wondering, would she be eligible for the youth academy? I couldn't believe it. Eleanor Whitmore, the woman who'd laughed in my face, who'd told me I'd never belong, was sitting here asking me for a favor. For a second, I just looked at her, letting the weight of it settle. Her granddaughter, Olivia's niece, probably, wanted in on what we'd built. The same woman who'd spent years keeping people out was now knocking on my door, hoping I'd let her family back in. I could have said no, could have thrown it back in her face and told her to figure it out herself. But that wasn't the point. I smiled, just a little, and leaned forward. "If she's got the talent and the dedication," I said, "she'll be welcomed, just like everyone else." Simple as that. No special treatment, no backroom deals, just the same rules we'd set for every kid who walked through our gates. Eleanor nodded, slow and deliberate, like she was chewing on my words. "Thank you," she said, barely above a whisper, and I could see something shift in her eyes. It wasn't just gratitude, It was understanding, maybe for the first time. She'd fought so hard to keep this place exclusive, to hold on to that old Whitmore way, but now she was seeing what I'd been saying all along. True excellence didn't come from shutting people out. It came from giving them a chance, letting them prove themselves. She stood up, smoothing her coat, and I could tell she didn't know what else to say. "I'll tell her to apply," she added, then turned and walked out, her steps softer than when she'd come in. I watched her go, the door clicking shut behind her, and sat there for a minute, letting it sink in. The Whitmore empire was gone, really gone. Not just the plaques or the power, but the whole idea they'd built it on. Eleanor asking for a spot for her granddaughter was the final lesson, the one she'd resisted so long. I picked up the scholarship form again, the 13-year-old girl's stats staring back at me, and got back to work. Outside, the club was waking up, kids laughing, clubs swinging, the future taking shape. This was what it was all about, opportunity, not exclusivity. And with that, I turned the page, ready for whatever came next.